Welcome back. In this video, we will look at the provider in order to provide us with data online. In order for you to follow what I'm going to do in this video, I'm assuming that you have worked through these previous videos of mine. So if you did not, I've got 3 videos from my Dart playlist. So you can see in my Dart playlist, I explain what is a future. The second video there, I explain how to read data online. And in the third video there, I show you how to read JSON data in Dart. So I'm going to build on those 3 videos. So if you have not watched them, or let's say you already know how to read data from the internet, and in specific also JSON data, then it's fine. You don't need to go through them again. And then the previous video in this playlist that we're currently busy with, I talked about the provider package. So you'll need to know the basics of the provider package also to understand this video. So make sure that you've gone through all of these videos in order to make sure that you will follow along nicely in this example. Nonetheless, I will go through this one slowly. So even though you have not gone through these, I'm sure you will be able to pick up fast. Right, so what I've done in this video called, I think it's using futures to read data online, or online data, this video there. In that video, I show you how to create your own Dropbox environment or to install Dropbox and then use Dropbox to provide some JSON files for you. So I'm in my Dropbox folder. I'm under a folder called JSON, and I've created stories. So there's a stories.json file, and if I open up this stories.json file, you will see that is just a few stories that I took from www.cbsnews.com. And this is the JSON file, basically. So you will see that the JSON file opens and closes with a curly bracket, and then it's got key value pairs. So I've got a key called stories, and then the value is a list of maps again. And every map here inside of this list of stories will basically just be a new story. And every single one of these stories has got a key and a value pair, and it's a string and a string. So for example, we have the heading, we've got the story, we've got the date, and we've got an image link. So what I want to do in this example for today is we want to read from this file from anywhere. Now, because this file is in Dropbox, it is in fact online, and I can get its online location by just saying copy the Dropbox link for me. So we will use that link now inside of this video, and you can then also type it on your side if you want to try and read from the exact same file. Or you can just go and create your own file and see if you can also do this. And by having your own Dropbox folder, then you can actually provide your own JSON files for your own applications that just read some static data. Well, it's static unless you go and change it. I mean, I've got access to this file, and I can go and change something on this file, and then when somebody refreshes my application, he will see the new data. So yes, it is static data that we read, which means we cannot update the data from the app, but I can update it from my own PC by just going into the file and saving it again. Okay, so what we will do is we will read from these stories, and we're going to display or create an app. We will show the picture right at the top. So that will become the picture for the new story. We will have the heading, and then underneath that, we will have the story. We will also use some refresh buttons and also the drag down to refresh, just to show you how that part works as well. Okay, so enough talking now. Let's get into the application. So I'm going to keep open this stories file so we can actually refer back to it. So I'm just going to move it down the bottom and get rid of this page. Okay, so make sure that you've gone through these videos, please, in order to have a basic background of what we will do now. Okay, so I created a new folder called Provider JSON Video, or a new project folder. And inside of that project folder, I have got my main.dart. My main.dart is just a material app there that goes to storage page. And storage page, you can see it's under pages stories. So I've got under my lib folder, a folder called pages, and there's my first page. It's called stories.dart. It's a state list widget. It's got a scaffold with an app bar, and it says top stories, CBS News, and this is what you see. Now there's 2 packages that we will be using. So if you go to your pubspec.yaml, you can add these 2 packages. So we will be using the provider package. So it's provider 500 and then HTTP 0.13.3. So make sure you include that into your pubspec.yaml file and you save so it gets included in your project. So next, let's go and create another folder. So in your lib folder, I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call this one models. Now we will only have one model here, so I'm going to create this file and call it news_data. And this is the model that the provider package should provide for us in our application. So I'm going to use this as a normal class called newsData. And as you've seen in my video, in order to use this class to be provided by provider, we need to use with change notifier. So I'm going to get this one from foundation ... and then let's just create our opening and closing brackets. So this is a mixin that we are using here. Okay, so if you remember again, this change notifier will basically just notify us of any changes that was made inside of this class. Okay, so I'm going to start with this class now and look at what we need to get provided. So if you remember then, if we look at this file again, you will remember that any JSON file basically is a map or similar to a map in Dart or in Flutter. And this map will have normally keys, and you can see all of the keys. I've got a key called source there also, but all of the keys are strings. But the values can be a list in this case. There it's a map, so it can be different. Okay, so the first thing that I want to get provided here, because we're going to read from a JSON file, I want to get a map provided throughout my application. So this map we're going to read back now, but we will need this map to be the key of type string, and the values that we get back from those keys can be then dynamic, which means anything. I'm going to use this as a private map, and I'm going to initially set it to just an empty map. Then I'm going to also have a Boolean error. So if there's an error that takes place, then we can set this Boolean to true, and we know that there was an error that took place. And alongside that error, we also need an error message. So we can also set that error message to something. For now, I'm just going to initialize it with nothing. Right, and these are basically the only values that we will need provided. So we will read back the map. If we've got the map, then it's fine. But if something went wrong, then we will set error to true, and we'll set our error message to something that happened there, some error message. If you followed those videos of mine, you see that we used a feature also to get back that data from using a link. So I'm going to do something similar that I did in those videos. I'm going to use a feature, but I'm not really going to return back any data. I'm just going to set that maps data to it. So I'm not going to return back any data. So it's just going to be a future void. It's going to be a getter method inside of this class, and I'm going to call it fetch data. Now this fetch data will be an asynchronous function, and let's open up that function. Okay, so it's just a normal getter. It's called fetch data, and we are using an asynchronous function in order to return back or get back a future value, although our future value will basically not be returned. So all we're going to do inside of here is we're going to say final response equals, we're going to wait for the result to come back, and we're going to use the get function here. So on this get function, you can just use control dot and make sure that you import that HTTP package. Okay, so it's going to be get. And what do we want to get? We want to go to uri.parse. And then the data that we're going to pass in here will just be that link of ours. Okay, so where do I get that link? Okay, so if I go back to my JSON folder inside of Dropbox, you can see all's got the check mark next to it, which means my data is live and I can directly read now from it. So I'm going to go to the stories and I'm going to right click and say copy Dropbox link. And that's the link that I want to start pasting now in here. And then I'm going to use, instead of www, I'm going to replace it with a DL. So if you want to use the exact same file as I'm using now, you can just type this value also there for yourself. And that will include that same file as the JSON file that you will then also read from. Okay, so we created a getter called fetch data that will just fetch the data. It won't actually return anything back for me. It is just a future void. but it's still a future, so we will still be waiting for the result to come back. Why does it need to be a future? Because we need this function to be asynchronous. Okay, so let's just go down. After this, we need to check this response now. So there will be some sort of response, and this is where we can get some errors. So if the response status code is in fact a 200, like on a normal web page, if the response is 200, then we know that everything went fine. So the connection to this link was then fine, and now we want to try and parse the data on that file. So it could be that inside of this file, as an example, I left out, let's say, that comma there. And by leaving out that comma, it will actually throw me an exception. So we need to catch those type of exceptions also, just to make sure that our application is working as expected. Okay, so I'm going to start with a try and a catch block here. And I'm just going to catch some sort of exception there, and we will get back to that now. Okay, so in the try block, what we want to try and do here is to get a value for this map now. So we declared the map at the top. It is currently an empty map, but as soon as this connection is done, and we've got a response code of 200, we know the connection was successful, then we can start getting back this map. So in order to get back the map, I'm going to use JSON decode. And I need to provide a source for this JSON decode. And as you've seen in my previous videos, we will use response.body. And that response.body will then basically read all the data for me inside of this file and decode it as JSON data, and we get it back as a map. So now we know inside of this map, we now have the data of this JSON file. So you can see that it starts off with an opening and a closing brace. So that's the map that we're getting back. Whatever is inside, we will look at that now. But for now, we've got this entire map back by just calling JSON decode response.body. Okay, so if this line then worked, because if this line doesn't work and there's something wrong, for example, I left out a comma, then there's an exception that will occur. And what we can do then in the exception is we can say error should now be true. That's one thing that should happen. And we should also get the error message. So that error message will then be set to, and this exception, the E there, will contain that message. So instead of providing my own error there, I will say e.getMessage, or not e.toString. And that will contain that error message for me. So setting the error to true, setting error message to what type of error gets returned by that E, that exception that occurred, and then inside of this map, so if this line did not go through, there's something wrong there, then it's going to catch this exception, it's going to set error to true and the error message to the error message. But if that is all fine, then we go to the next line. And here we can actually set that error again to false, just to make sure it is still false. Remember, we have it as false at the top, but maybe something else could have happened. So I'm just making sure that the error is in fact false. Okay, then after the try and the catch block, I will go and call notify listeners. So wherever in my app I'm listening for this map, the error or the error message, it will be updated because I'm changing map there, I'm changing error here, and in the catch I'm changing error and error message. So maybe something that we should also do inside of this exception is maybe to set this map again as just an empty map, just to make sure that we did not get some null or what type of data back there. So I'm just setting it back to an empty map, and then all the listeners will be notified. Okay, so this is all still inside of the first if. So if that if statement is then not true, which means that there's an actual error, we could not get to that connection. So this could be where I've left out something on this link and we actually cannot make that connection to the link, or there's no internet connection or whatever. So again, I'm going to set that error to true, basically the same as that we did here. So I'm just going to copy this part just to make sure that we get that same type of data back. And now we don't have e.getString. We don't know really what the exception was. So we can try and go and test some different status codes and so forth. I'm not going to go into that now, so I will just show a message like it could be your internet connection, or let's say error at the front first. Error, it could be your internet connection, so you can maybe go and check his internet connection and then try again or refreshing. Okay, so we've got error set to true, we've got error message set to a specific message, and then we've got this map set to an empty map again, just to make sure that we're still at an empty map. And then the same thing again, we will need to start notifying all the listeners. So probably we are repeating too much lines of code here. So I'm going to take this one out, notify the listeners, cut it out there, and we can just do it once at the end. So when this whole coding stops, either the if or the else that happened, we can then notify the listeners of these changes in the data. Okay, and that is basically it for this function called fetch data. So what is it going to do? It's going to fetch the data, try and fetch this data. If the status code is 200, everything was fine, and then we try and get the map. But if something goes wrong with getting the map, it will catch. We will set the error and the error message and the map to basically nothing again. If it worked, we will have the map and we set error to false. If the status code is not 200, which means the connection did not go through as successfully, then we will have this else part where we also set error to true, error message to something, and then we set the map to its initial value again. And then we notify the listeners. Okay, and then we can also provide maybe something like a void initial values. So I'm going to use this function also in order to just set everything back to their initial values. So I'm going to set back the map to an empty map, just like we did at the top there. We will set error to false again, and we'll set error message to nothing again. And then we're going to call notify listeners. Okay, so you'll see where we're going to use that function, but it's just calling a function to set those initial values back. So this is when we will be refreshing. It's one way of refreshing, just to put those values back to the initial values so that we show nothing on the screen. And then when the data gets back again, we will have new values. Right, then the last part for this class called news data is we need getters for these three values. Okay, so let's just create those getters right at the bottom there. So we will have a map of type string, and it will be dynamic for the key, or the key will be string, and the values will be dynamic. So we're going to use the getter, and instead of just using underscore map, I'm referring to a getter called map, and that map will just return back the underscore map for me. Okay, so that's just the getter for this first value there. So maybe let's just put it underneath those. So I'm going to cut this here. And it's easier maybe to understand. So there's the getter for the map. So we want to get back that one. We will just use that news data object, and we're going to call .map, and we will get back the map. Okay, and then also the getter for that error. So we'll have a Boolean get error, and we will just be sending back that error. Well, the private one. Right, and then we will also have a string getter for the error message, and this one will be returning back that error message. Okay, so what we did now was just to create getter values for these three. So if we want to get them back, we will just be referring to map, to error, or to error message. So these remain private inside of this class, inside of its own file. We will not have access directly to underscore map, underscore error, or error message. So we will need to use the getters in order to get back those values. And just note that we're not setting anything outside of this class, so we don't need setters. This fetch data will set the data for me. So it's going to set the error, and it's going to set the map and the error message, depending on what happened. Okay, so this is my news data class, and this is the data that we want to get provided by the provider package. So when we start using provider, we will refer back to this news data, which will contain this map. And this is the main data that we are interested in. And all the rest is just for a bit of error handling. And we get the getters to get back all of those. Fetch data will go to this link, check the response. If it's 200, we get back the data we actually want. And all the rest is just some error handling. Then we've also got this initial values, and you'll see where we're going to use that. It's just to set everything back to its initial values when we refresh. Okay, so now let's go and design our stories. So in the main dot, you will see my application starts. It runs my app. My app is a material app. Now I've done routes already, but because we're going to use only one page, it doesn't make sense to actually use that whole routes file because, I mean, the only thing I'm going to use is one page. So then it's not needed for us to use any routes. Okay, so we're going to just go to the home page or the stories page, and it's inside of this stories.dot. So if I go to stories.dot under pages, there I've got it, and this is my storage page. It's the one that we see here. So it's the only page that we're going to use. And you can see that it starts with a scaffold, an app bar, and the text widget then as part of the app bar. Okay, now after this, we can start with the body. Now, as the top part of my body, I'm going to start with something we call a refresh indicator. Okay, and the only thing that this refresh indicator will do is that when we drag down from the top, it will have that little refresh button. Okay, so the body will start with a refresh indicator so that we can actually refresh the whole page. And the refresh indicator must have a function called onRefresh, and we're going to get back to this one later on. Now, in order to just get rid of this error that we currently have here, I'm going to just use an async there. So this onRefresh will be asynchronous because what we're going to do in this onRefresh is actually go back to our news data, and we're going to call this fetch data. So we'll do that now. So this refresh indicator needs an onRefresh, and it will also have a child. And then if you see if you specify the child, then everything else, all the errors disappear. Okay, so I'm going to use a center widget right from the start. So basically what we want to start now doing is inside of the center widget, we want to have data that will now be updated or provided by our provider. So I'm going to go back to the main dot, and over this storage page, I'm going to add a widget. And the widget will be a change notifier provider. Now, from my previous videos, you know, yes, you can use the child, but it's better to actually use the builder. So I'm going to use the builder there. I'm going to use this one. And for the builder, I will just be basically returning the storage page. Okay, and then for the change notifier also, we will need a create there, and we're going to use the fat arrow there for the create. And the create will basically just point to our news data file, the one that we have with the change notifier, and this is the one we want to get provided throughout our application. Okay, so it's going to be called news data. So that's the one that I want to use here. So I'm going to say news data, and then all errors will disappear. Okay, so we are basically having a change notifier provider right at the top, which means that everything underneath this now, and that includes everything in the storage page, will then be provided when something changes, or will be notified when something changes in news data. So here we create an instance of this class, which means currently our map is at 0 or nothing. And then we can go and add to it now. So let's go back to stories. Now, right at the top of this build function, we want to start running this fetch data. So this fetch data here will be called by just going to the object called news data and calling fetch data on it. So remember how we do that. So inside of here, we can refer to that build context. On the context, we're going to call either watch or read. But because we are now outside of the widget tree where we're currently at, in this return statement, we are in the widget tree. So we are outside of the widget tree. So we're going to use the read function of the provider, which means it will not listen for any values, but we can just do something. And the data that we want to read from is now this news data. Control dot on it. Yes, let's get that news data, and control dot on it again. Okay, that doesn't want to give us the provider. So let's just start typing provider here and just import it. So that's at the top, and then we can remove that line again. And now everything's fine. Now on that, we're going to put the dot, and you can see I've got access to error data. I've got access to the map that's currently just an empty map, and so forth. But the one that we are interested in is called fetch data. And notice that I'm not using a wait or anything here, because you can't basically have an async function for your build. So that's not allowed. So this thing will just run in the background. And as soon as it's done and updated our data, all of these notifiers or all of these listeners for these will be notified as soon as we're done. So this build method will be done before this part is actually done. And as soon as this part finishes, then it will call notify listeners, and everywhere we listened now, which we will set up now, we will start getting that data. Right, so let's go into this center. Now for the center widget, I'm going to have a child, which will now be something that will be listening for data from that news data. So I'm going to use consumer. The type of this consumer will be the same type that we are referring there at the top, and that will be news data again. Now, for a consumer, we also need that build function. So we're going to use the builder, and then we're going to use this one with the opening and closing brackets so we can do a bit more inside of here. Right, so if you look at your consumer now, this value that we have there is now in fact news data, which means it's this object that was created. And now we have got access to this map. We've got access to error. We've got access to the error message through these getters. Okay, so let's see how we can use them now. Okay, so now inside of this builder, we will return back something. And you can see that's why it's giving us this error now. So we need to return back a widget that we want to show here. But it's not as easy as just showing the widget. So what we want to do is to first go and check a few things. This value is now an instance of news data. And you can see if you put a dot there, you've got access to error, the error message, and you've got access to the map. So if the map.length is equal to 0, then we know that this part is not done yet. Okay, because the map is still at 0, just an empty map. So if the length is 0, and also at the same time, value.error is in fact false. So I'm going to say not true. So if the map.length is equal to 0 and the value.error is false. Okay, so we're basically saying if the map's length is 0 and we have error still at a false value, then question mark. So this is your ternary operator here. So if this part is true, if that whole part is true, then we want to start showing our progress bar in the middle of the screen. Okay, so if the map's length is still 0 and we do not have an error, so which means not an error, then we can start showing the progress bar. So I'm going to use a circular progress indicator. Otherwise, I want to check again for something else. So let me just place this to a new line so we can see a bit better. Okay, let's put that one also there. Okay, so we're asking now if the map is empty and there's no error. We show the circular progress indicator. Okay, the next part I'm going to test again. If the value is in fact an error now, so if that part is not true, so after the question mark, if this part is true, then we show a circular progress indicator. If that's not true, then we first check, maybe there was some error. So if there's an error, I'm going to show a text widget, and that text widget should have, let's say, something like, oops, something went wrong, and we can show that error message. So we can go to value dot, and you can see there's error and error message. And maybe in order to get this text in the middle of the screen, I'm going to add a line property there. So it's the text align. Okay, so the text align will be text align dot center. Okay. Right, so as soon as we save now, everything will become a bit clearer. Okay, so we're saying there at the front, we're saying if the map's length is 0, so it's an empty map, and there's no error, then we show a circular progress indicator. If that part is false, then we check if there's an error, question mark again. So if there's an error, then show this text field or text widget, which says, oops, something went wrong, and we show the error message. Then you can see text align and so forth. That's still part of the text. But if value.error is false, which means there's no error, then we know. So if we know that this one is false, then we know the map's length is not 0 or there's an error. Okay, so if we test then if there's an error and there's also no error, then the last part here means that we actually got the data back and we need to start showing the data on the screen. So this last one then means we actually got the data back and we want to start showing something on the screen. Right, so for this part, we're going to use a list view dot builder. And for this builder, I'm going to use an item builder there. So I'm going to say item builder. Let's use the brackets. And for now, I'm just going to return back a normal text widget. So we will do something now inside of this. And let's just say something like hello. At the end of our list view builder, just make sure that you've got your semicolon as well. So if I save now, it will nicely format it for me, and maybe we can see a bit more. Okay, so you see it updated, and it's giving me an unending list of hellos on the screen, but we'll get to that now. Right, so let's quickly recap this because this is a mouthful. Okay, so we've got a consumer right at the top that will be looking at this news data it needs to be providing, and we will be returning back this whole thing. So let's just go through this. We will either be returning back a circular progress indicator or a text widget that will contain an error or the actual data. Okay, so how do we get to them? So the first part, we're testing if the map is still at 0, the length of the map is 0, so there's no data yet for it, which means this part is not done yet, that fetch data, and there's no error. So that's why I'm saying no, not value.error, no error. Then we're going to show the circular progress indicator. But if this part is false, remember both needs to be true for this whole thing to be true. So if the length is not equal to 0 or there's an error, then this thing will be false. Then we test again. So then we're testing, well, if there's then an error because it's either the length or it's the error. Okay, so we're testing first for the error. So if it's the error, then we will show this text widget. The text widget will say, oops, something went wrong, and it will show that error message. Okay, but if that is also false, if there's no error, and this thing is false, then it means that the length must not be 0, which means we've got some data. And then we will show the list view.builder. And in our case, we're just showing the hello there. So for the list view.builder, we will also need to have that item count. And let's set the item count now as 7, but we will change that now. So if we save this now, we should only see 7 hellos there. Okay, so at this stage, because we see those 7 hellos, we know that we actually got data in that map. So for example, if we go to this file now, and let's say I'm taking out that heading there, or just that comma, and I save this now, going back here and running this, you will see right from the start, it should now start off with the circular progress bar until the data is got back. And then there's the error also. Oops, something went wrong. There's a format exception. Okay, so now we know where the error is, but we can go and fix it. I will save it again. And when I go back and we rerun this again, then we will see that everything should be fine. So we will start off with a circular progress indicator first. And there we see the hellos. So there was no error, so we will be seeing this part. So right at the start, when we're still waiting for this part to finish, we will just see the circular progress indicator. When fetch data is done, remember what happens when fetch data is done? It will call this notify listeners. And then we've got this map of data, and then it means that map length will change, so it will come back to this return statement. The consumer will refresh this part, and we will start seeing the list view.builder. Okay, so now what do we want to do in this list view.builder? Well, firstly, let's go and have a look at this file. So if you look at this file, you will see that we've got a key called stories, and that stories is returning back a list. And there's position 0, position 1, and position 2. So by going to my big map, which is the JSON file, and calling the key stories, I will get back a list. Okay, so let's go and have a look at that. So if I am inside of my builder here, let's just go there. So let's get the item count. It should actually be 3 because we've got 3 stories there. So I'm going to refer to this value that's part of the consumer. Value is that news data. So now we've got that map. So I'm going to say value.map. And that will now contain something. And that's now a whole map. But the only thing we need is, in fact, the key called stories. So by calling value.map stories, we get back a list. So what do we get back? We get a list of, this is the list we're getting back. So it's a list of 3 maps. Okay, so I can actually just go and call dot length. Now it doesn't really know the type of this, and that's why the length doesn't get picked up automatically, but you can just type it. So the item count will actually be 3 there. So if we run this or save now again, we should only see 3 hellos because that story's length is only 3. Right, great so far. So now inside of this return statement, this should never be a very long thing. So what I would rather do is to go and create another state list widget, and let's call this one a news card. So we're going to use a simple card. So that's in the container here. Instead of a container, we will start off with a card. And that card will display all our data for us. So instead of having that text widget there now, we will be returning this news card. And we will define now how this one looks. But basically what we want to do for this news card is we want to basically send through only one of these depending on the index where we currently are in the builder. So if you look at your builder, there's an item count and there's an index. So it knows exactly how many times to run. It needs to run 3 times. And the index will start at 0, 1, and 2. So we need that index in order to send through the data to this news card. So the only data we want to actually send is a simple map with a key and a value pair where the key is a string and the value is a string as well. But now because it comes from a JSON file, I would rather declare it as a map that has a string as the key and dynamic as a value. Okay, so let's declare it in here as a final map. That is the map that we're going to pass through to news card. And that map will be of type, we know it's going to be string string. Let's try it string string, but we'll probably get a problem there. Okay, so the key and the value will both be string. And then we can give it a name like, let's just say map there. And because we need to get it back in the constructor, I'm going to have it as required map or this dot map. Okay, everything is happy so far. Okay, so now inside of this news card, we need to pass through that map now. Okay, so that news card or this item builder, at this stage, we have the whole map there. So we only want to send through what? So if we go back again, we've got this whole map. Okay, so what we want to send through is only that stories, which will return back a list, but the list at a specific index value. Okay, so if we refer to this then, we will go to that value. On that value, I'm going to call map. So that's the whole map. It's the whole JSON file. The only part that I want is the stories part. Sorry, before I continue, it's a named argument there. So let's just have map there. Okay, so we're going to go to value, which is this, just go there, which is this news data. Okay, so value is news data. Dot map returns back what? Returns back the whole map from there up until there. When I refer to stories, it will return back the list. Okay, so now I've got the list, but I only want to get that list at a specific index. So the index there in the item builder will start at 0, then 1, and then 2. So every time it passes in there, it will pass to me either this one or this one. So that one is position 0, this one is position 1, and that one is position 2. Okay, so we're passing through a map, but that map comes from value.map, which is the total JSON file. We go into stories, which only gives me a list of maps, and we go to a specific index, which will be 0, 1, or 2, to get back a map that is of type string string. Okay, so now we've got the map this side in our news card, and actually you can take this news card now and place it in its own file. That will be totally fine because we're just passing through that data that we already got in here and we're passing it along. Okay, so now inside of this card, let's set the elevation for this card as a 10 maybe. Let's have a child there and we will start off with a column. Now this column will now contain 3 things. It will basically contain the picture and then the heading and the story. Now let's set the cross-axis alignment for this as cross-axis alignment.start. So we have everything on the left-hand side of the screen. and let's add some children here. So maybe for this column, let's add some padding also. So I'm going to add some padding for this, and let's set the padding as 8. That will be fine. And for the card as well, let's add some padding for the card. And let's leave it at 8. We will check it now. Okay, so for the children then, inside of this column, we will start with an image.network. So you would see that inside of this file, I refer to image here, and that image is a network image. It's got their own link. Okay, so I'm just going to go into this list now that was, or the map that was passed through to that new card. I will just refer to the key called image, and it will return back this value for me. Okay, so the source then there, where's the source now? Okay, so we need to go through this map that was passed in. So I'm going to go and say map, and from that map, give me the key, and that key we called image. So give me the key back that is called image. Okay, so this will, let me just add this as a string. It won't pick it up as a string. So let's go in there, make that a string, use string interpolation there, and this should be fine. Okay, so let's save now. Okay, and there you can see that dynamic comes through. It will basically say string dynamic is not of subtype, type map string string. Okay, so that's why I said let's have this one as dynamic as well, just to make sure that everything is actually fine. Okay, and there you can see the images start popping up. Okay, so there we have the 3 images actually showing. Okay, now we just need the stories. Okay, so after that image, let's have a sized box, and let's have a height of, let's say, 10. Now let's have a text widget, and one will be the heading, and the other one will be the actual story. So now in order to get the heading, so we've got the image by saying map image. So how will we do the rest? Let me just copy this part, because that's exactly what we're going to use in here. Right, so now instead of using image there, let's go and have a look at this. To get the heading, we're going to use heading. To get the story, we're going to use story. Okay, so let's just use heading here. Let's save. And there's all the headings. Quite nice. Let's just style the heading a bit, because a heading should probably be bold. So let's say style, text style. Let's set the font weight to a font weight. Let's make it 800. And let's set the font size to a 20. Let's save. Okay, so there we've got a bit bigger headings, and now the only thing we still need to have is, in fact, another text widget that looks exactly the same, just not the same styling. And come on, let's paste it there, and let's have that same sized box maybe again between these two, and maybe we can have that same sized box at the end also. Okay, so now we've got the heading there, and here we want to have the actual story. So just have a look at that file again. We need to refer to the story there. Right, so let's save now and see what we get. Okay, so that one is basically too bold. So let's remove the font weight, or let's just use it as a W400. And this one, let's go to 12 and save. Okay, maybe 12 is too small. Okay. And there we've got our stories. So we've got bigger ship in Iran's navy catches fire and sinks under unclear circumstances. And there's the next story and the next story. Okay, everything seems to work. So we are actually reading data back from the internet, from that JSON file, into our application. Okay, so now let's see if we can do the refreshes quickly. So let's go to the refresh indicator. You can see it already works. If I drag down, you can see it's there, but it's not doing anything. Okay, so inside of this refresh indicator in the async, the only thing I want to actually do in here is to call the await keyword, and let me do it without the await. It's actually not needed, but I'll show you why we actually want to have it there. So we will say context.read. So again, we're going to read. We're not going to listen. We're just going to run something. And what we want to run, in this case, it will be that news data of ours, that model class of ours, and we want to call that fetch data again. So as soon as we refresh, we want to fetch the newest data again. So in order for us to actually see if this works, let's just change something. So instead of saying the biggest ship, let's say the smallest ship here. Okay, I'm going to save that. So if we refresh now, look at the refresh. If I leave it, it's done. It's gone. It just disappeared. But it did update the data. But it seems as if nothing happened. So if I add the await there, then that refresh, if I drag it down, it will stay there until that part is actually done and it's done refreshing. Okay, so let's change it back to biggest. Save it again. Let's drag it down. So you see now it's connecting. The refresh disappears. We should see biggest. And there we go. Okay, so that's how you can do your refresh indicator by using async, and then use your await if you want to have it on the screen while it is refreshing. Otherwise, it will just disappear and you won't see that refresh indicator. Okay, so now we've got a circular progress indicator here that's already working. So maybe we can add also a refresh button at the top. So if you don't like this one, that is just the drag refresh, you can also have one at the top. So on the app bar, let's add a few actions there. Well, actually only one action, and I'm going to use an icon button for that. Let's apply an icon for it, and we will say icons dot, there should be a refresh. Let's use the normal refresh there, that's fine. And let's go to the on pressed of this icon button, and maybe let's just use that one. Okay, and the only thing I need to do here again is exactly what we did there. We need to fetch the data. So let's do this here as well. So I'm going to save. Now let's click on refresh, and you can see now nothing happens. Okay, but I want to show you, you can actually go here. Let's change this biggest to smallest again. Okay, so I'm going to click that. Seems as if nothing's happening, but it updated to smallest. Okay, so if you want to see something happening, that is why I have created this initial values. So setting the initial values back to an empty map where the length is 0 and the error is false, it means that in this part, let me just go back to stories. In this part where we start checking now, the length will be 0 again, and the value will not be an error, which means we will see the circular progress bar. So just before this one, before we start fetching the data, I will call that function that we created, what is it, on initial values. Okay, so let's save this one, which means that first set everything back to zeros and then get the new data. Okay, so let me just quickly refresh this. Let's add a biggest there again. Save it, and let's click the refresh button. Okay, so now the refresh is in the middle of the screen, the circular indicator, until we get back the new data, and then everything's back to normal again. Okay, so two types of refreshes that you can use. This one that refreshes the whole page, or just the drag down that refreshes while you look at the data still. So this drag refresh is not removing the data on the screen, but it's still showing that circular indicator. This one is showing your whole screen as a circular indicator, and then it refreshes. Okay, so like I said, what would have been best for this news card is if you go into your lib folder and you create maybe a new folder and you call this one widgets, and then we call this widget news card. So I will right click, say new widget there, or new file, and we're going to call this news underscore card dot dot, and I can place this then, this news card, that whole class I can place in its own file. So let me just copy that one. I'm going to cut it out here, which will give us an error, but don't worry. Go to news card. I will have just an import material dot at the top. Let's paste it there. Could have some problems here. None. Okay, let's save. No problems. Go back to stories. Now it cannot pick up that news card. So you just use control dot, and you can use your new file you created, and it will add news card. Save it again, and we can actually rerun, and everything should still work. Okay, so I'm just rerunning this, and you can see it's refreshing now. getting the newest data. There I can see the data. It's loading the pictures now. And I can see all the pictures is loaded. So there's all my stories now. I can still refresh and refresh again. Okay, so the whole app is working as expected now. We've got under our lib folder models. We will place all our different models, our different pages, and our different widgets. And it's easy then, if I want to change something on the layout of this, I know it's done in NewsCard. So I can just go to NewsCard and make some changes here. I hope you've learned from this video. See you in the next one.